So this tutorial is for Ben specifically, but this might be useful for the rest of you as well. So I'm just gonna record this and post it to the Miro board and send you all a link. Ben is asking how one would go about um, being able to teleport if the VR pawn was made a child of another actor. So, for instance, Ben is using a rig rail to move the pawn character, thereby sort of taking the player on a tour. But then at the end of the tour, wants to be able to allow the player to teleport and move about on their own. The best way to go about that is to possess an entirely new pawn. And so that would be like the equivalent of my soul possessing another body and then, operating within another body, right? Can't do it in real life, but we certainly can do it in a video game environment. So in my scene, here we have our tower, or sorry, our capsule space. And this is from the last tutorial on making the instructions. Um, if you recall, we are typically spawning at the player start location. The player start, all that it does is it holds this transform, and remember, transform is just location, rotation, and scale. It just holds that position for a player to then spawn into this location. So if we go into our world settings, and if you don't see that tab, you can just go in here under Windows and check world settings, and this tab will show up. We're operating within the VR game mode. If you guys are experimenting with first person and third person game modes, you can always switch game modes here. And what this will do is it'll establish your default pawn. So in our VR game mode, our default pawn class is the VR pawn. And so what this will do is wherever there's a player start, it's going to spawn this particular pawn into that location, right? If we're always using VR, which I think you guys all are, we don't actually need to start with a player start. We might actually delete that. And instead, if we go to our VR template, go into our blueprints, we can drag the VR pawn into our scene and just choose to possess that. So I'm just going to rotate my VR pawn, and you can see it looks a little different. There's like a camera attached to it, and this is a blueprint of the pawn class, and it has all of the motion controller, all of the functionality that that's here, right? So it's essentially the same thing, except now we're actually spawning into or we're possessing a pawn that's already in the scene, as opposed to having it spawn upon um, at the player start location. I know that seems like a lot, but it's kind of an important point when thinking about these things, just because we want to be able to control, what pawn or what characters we can possess, and we can always switch, right? We have the ability to switch bodies essentially in VR, right? The only thing we need to do is with this VR pawn, I need to auto possess player zero. So everything starts with zero in Unreal. So player zero is actually player one, and that's the only player. So we want this pawn, we put it in our scene, and we want player zero, or the first player, to possess it. Okay, and so now if I hit play, it's gonna look exactly the same as it did, except now the VR pawn is actually in the scene, right? But what if I want to switch and become a different character, or um, become a different thing? So like if you think about games like Grand Theft Auto, the player can run to a car, get into the car, and then all of a sudden the player starts to drive the car. Well, what's happening there is the character is actually possessing a car pawn, as opposed to um, a person pawn that walks around in third person, right? So let's just grab another VR pawn, and I'm going to toss it over here, right? And we can see now we have VR pawn 2, we have VR pawn 1, except our possessed player here is disabled, right? So what we want to be able to do is go from this pawn, which is something that we possess in the beginning of the game, and we're going to want to then possess this pawn based on some sort of event that we create a blueprint for. And the type of blueprint we would use to change that is what's called I think it's called a player controller pawn. So I'm going to just go into my blueprint folder. I'm going to right click and I'm going to click on blueprint class. I'm going to create a new blueprint class, except this time, typically we've been using actor. I'm going to use a player controller, right? And I'm going to call this player controller. I'm going to call it JK, just my initials, right? And so in player controller JK, I want to be able to use this blueprint to have the character um, um, or the character controls jump from one pawn to another, right? And so back in our world settings, notice that our VR game mode also has a player controller class, and this is like the default player controller class. I'm going to want to switch this to the new player controller that I just created. And you can see when I click on the drop down menu, now that player controller JK, which is what I just created, is available for me to use. And so I switch that over and I can go now into my player controller, go into the event graph, and I can start to script how that player controller is going to control certain aspects of my gameplay controllability. I'm not using the right terminology, but I hope you understand what I mean, right? And so we can use any event that we have available to us to do that. So for instance, in a game like Grand Theft Auto, I get near a car and then I, can jump into the car and I possess it, right? So there's probably some kind of a collision box around the car, and once I collide into it and I press a button or do something, I can possess the car character as opposed to the person character, right? And usually it's like a Boolean operation. If I'm colliding with a character, make a certain Boolean true. And if that Boolean is true, if I hit the X button, then I can possess this new character, right? So we can do any number of things as we use blueprints to generate these types of actions, right? And so in my case, maybe what I want to do is just wait a little while and then let the pawn or let the character player or let the player rather possess a different pawn, right? So we start with the pawn that's in the capsule, and then I want to be able to possess the pawn that's like far away from where we are on that platform, right? And so if I want time to be the thing that determines that, right? So in Ben's case, he wants that tour to take place in the beginning of the game, and then after the tour ends and he goes up the elevator up to the Coliseum floor, then he can possess another pawn that can then teleport around and do something else. So he'll want to position the second pawn on the point where the tour ends, and also know how long the tour is going to take, because then we can on begin play just add a delay node and just say, okay, let's say the tour lasts 3 seconds. I can just have my delay last for 3 seconds. And then after 3 seconds, I can start possessing a different pawn, right? And so I can just time it instead of using collisions, for instance, right? But we can't just directly just say possess, right? We actually need to tell the blueprint what character to possess, right? And so what we want to do is get actor, rather, get all actors of class, right? And what we're going to want to do is get the VR pawn, right? And so it's going to look for every VR pawn in my scene and turn that into an array, which is what this little box with the little boxes look like, right? Like the 9 square grid. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get a very specific pawn. So I have two pawns in my scene. The first pawn is 0 and the second pawn is 1, right? And if there are more pawns, they would follow in sequence, right? So I actually want to possess the second, right? Don't be confused by one. One just means two in Unreal. I want to possess the second class of actors that are designated as VR pawn, and I want to do that after a delay of 3 seconds. So during this time, my first pawn is going on their tour, and once the tour ends, which I time to 3 seconds, then I can get that character to possess the second pawn. So now, if I hit play, I should start in the capsule, but in 3 seconds time, I'll then jump, right? My soul essentially will jump, my video game soul will jump into that second pawn. So let's go ahead and see if that works. But let's just do something else, right? Just so we can make sure that it's working properly. I'm gonna just create another delay node, right? And maybe this is good practice. So then in another 3 seconds, right? And in fact, I could probably just copy all of these and paste it, right? So in another 3 seconds, I want to then possess my first pawn again. So I'm switching this to 0. And so now after 3 seconds again, I should jump right back into the pawn that's inside of the capsule. So now I'm going to hit compile, and I'm just going to dock this here, right? So just to recap, I'm starting by possessing this pawn, and we can see that our player 0 is going to possess that pawn. Now when I hit begin play, I should then jump and possess this pawn in 3 seconds, because my player controller right after begin play will delay for 3 seconds and then possess this other pawn, which is pawn 1, or the second pawn I've placed in. And then what should happen is another 3 seconds later, I should pop back in and possess the original pawn again, right? So let's go ahead and give that a shot. And so I'm going to hit VR preview. I'm going to pop on my headset, and I'm in my pawn. And then all of a sudden, after 3 seconds, I've jumped to the other pawn, and now I'm back into that original pawn again. And so I'm just going to go ahead and turn on my hand controller so you can see the position of my hand. There they are. And then I should still be able to teleport the way I would want to, right? And then if I raise my hand, there's my blueprint for the instructions still work. Okay, so you could do this with any event. It certainly doesn't have to work with a delay. Like if I hit a trigger button, or if I collide with a trigger box or some other kind of collision, that could be the event that makes something happen or makes me possess a different pawn or a different character, right? In theory, we can go from a VR pawn to a third person or first person pawn. You can do all that type of thing as well. But hopefully this is helpful in gaining an understanding of what it means to possess a pawn. It's just like your souls being embodied in a variety of different virtual avatars or virtual, and we call those pawns. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful.